Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Taylor.
And I'm your co-host, John Micton. Join us every 2 weeks for conversations with international school leaders, educators, and innovators who are working and engaging in the world of international school education.
And finally, just to say a huge thanks to our valued partner, Faria Education Group. We'll jump back in later in the podcast to give you some more information about Faria Education Group. Okay, welcome to the podcast. I'm Dan Taylor. I'm here as always with John Micton. And today we have Wolfgang Soeldner. I would say the name wrong, I think. Who's second time guest. The first time was in Bet in a very crowded press area. So welcome to the podcast. Wolfgang and John, how are you both doing?
Fantastic. Thanks for having us on. And for being with John, it's quite a privilege to have him so close by now. That's fantastic.
Yeah, well, you're both working in the same school, same campus, but different buildings, as I've just discovered.
Yeah.
That's right.
And now we'd like to say a few words from our valued partner and sponsor, Faria Education Group. Faria Education Group has been with you through thick and thin, helping international schools minimize headaches and easing transitions. Whether through paperless submissions with Open Apply, curriculum first learning with ManageBack, or school-to-home management with Schools Buddy, Faria has been your partner.
What's more, Faria has been expanding with additional services, including professional development for international school educators. Mini PD is a professional learning platform by practitioners for practitioners, with a global community of learners and coaches. Mini PD makes the learning experience more personal, flexible, and equitable. Looking for a PD solution for your school or something for yourself? Sign up for individualized coaching and enjoy a 10% discount using the code ISPodcast. Head over to app.minipd.com. That's app.minipd.com to book your personal learning coach today. Mini PD, embracing the learner in every educator.
Yeah, fantastic. So, so this is probably one of the last chats we'll have, John. I'm off to Asia in 2 weeks, which should be great for 3 months to visit a lot of different things. I'm going to be at Aircourse. I'm going to be at Bet Asia. I'm going to be at EduTech in Singapore, plus meeting the team in the Philippines, Thailand, Hong Kong.
Aren't you going to Cambodia too?
Go to Cambodia. I'm on the British Department of International Trade trip with the British Educational Suppliers Association, which I managed to get on, which should be really
Awesome.
cool.
That should be really interesting, just
Yeah.
kind of in that context. And, Cambodia has such a rich and nuanced history, so it'll be interesting to see where they are, especially with tech. Because I remember when I lived in Africa, the internet wasn't working, but when mobile phones came, suddenly Africa did a big jump that I think a lot of European countries hadn't to mobile. And, mobile became so, it permeated throughout the whole African continent just for, a low cost, very powerful tool to do money transfers and share information. So it'll be interesting what's in Cambodia.
I heard, Kenya's got a direct internet connection to a UAE, and it's like super fast connection, and it's really turbocharged things in Kenya right now.
That's probably a lot better than Germany, who was stuck on ADSL for the longest time ever.
Yeah, a lot of the African countries have really gotten into tech and coding. Nigeria and South Africa, there's a lot of interesting things happening out of African countries in that field that I think they don't get the due coverage, or people aren't amplifying the amazing things that are happening there.
Yeah, definitely. Cool, guys. So Wolfgang suggested an interesting topic about core systems and why they get chosen, etc. What are the reasons? And then also, I think an interesting follow-up is about what happens when you come into a school and you inherit systems, like what to do about it, because it's usually, a bit of a hodgepodge, and it builds over time. And I think sometimes things get added on and not taken away. So do you want to start off? We'll talk about the core systems. I know Wolfgang or John, you want to kick off? Like, what about, Wolfgang, you mentioned, why don't you start? You mentioned your point about core systems, how they often get chosen for the wrong reasons. What do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think between all of us, we've encountered a lot of sort of the core systems being student information systems or curriculum management systems or learning management systems, and looking around what's being used at international schools, it seems that, you know, with time, it's nearly like the curriculum kind of thing. It's this sort of merry-go-round of you start off with something, you switch it off with something that's newer looking, fancier, and eventually sort of go all full circle and sometimes and back at where you started with some of these systems. Moodle being one of these great examples. I'm having lots of conversations at this school here about Moodle, and for so many years that was the go-to platform, being, you know, open source and all of this, and then it fell out of popularity for a lot of schools because these fancier new solutions came in, and a lot of schools that I know are now back at exploring Moodle and really seeing the benefits of some of the open access and the customization ability that you have with the platform. And it just made me wonder in the last couple of years of how are these things chosen. And there's not a single I don't think answer of how to do it positively, but for many reasons, often it's either to do with budgets, so you go for companies that sort of undercut or are the cheapest, or it's because somebody's promising you an integration with another system that you currently have, and that may or may not be possible. I've been at quite a few schools where a company's come in with their pitch and their initial whole outlining and has promised these, you know, seamless integration solutions or options, and that hasn't worked out. And I think it's this notion, and I'm not sure whether we all agree on this, but I've kind of come to the conclusion, this disillusion that a school or an organization has to have a single system to do all of it. I think I've come to the conclusion that that doesn't exist, and with that comes then the whole concept of, well, if it doesn't exist, then what's the next best step, and how do we look at systems to do all the different things that schools need: finance, HR, admissions, curriculum, academics, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that this one magic bullet for everything is what everybody's looking for. And some companies really kind of frame the conversation around that they are the one-stop shop. But, you know, it's so complicated because many of schools are built around personalities. So it's the personalities that build the systems. It's not the systems that build the personalities. And I think in the business world, there's far more a systems thinking approach, which is not as flexible maybe and not as nuanced or user friendly, but it's about, you know, how are we efficiently going to keep our costs down and make sure that everybody has access. And at schools, one of the challenges I've always faced is that you often inherit a system based on somebody's like or their skill set. And then there's a lot of, you know, creative tension around it, saying, well, this doesn't work anymore, we want something else. So I think it's one of the hardest things for an IT director is to come into a school where you inherit systems that are working for some people, but maybe the users don't feel that it's working, and then trying to go through that whole process of changing, that change management and getting buy-in. I find it really, really challenging.
Well, let's jump to that in a second, because I think that's a great second point about when you inherit systems, what to do. But I think I want to consider Wolfgang's point, because I kind of half agree and half disagree. I mean, first point is I'm a former Moodle admin, so I'm delighted to know that Moodle's making a comeback. That means I can always be in gainful employment if I ever short of money, I can become a Moodle. I had no idea Moodle was. I just heard it was dying a slow death, so that's fascinating news to me.
Dan, actually, a lot of U.S. universities' systems, like state systems, and in the UK, have adopted Moodle. Moodle's really, I think, for, you know, a lot of companies, Moodle's a good proposition because it's open source and there's so many people that you can tap into. I think you can actually get a lot done.
You can, definitely. You can. Yeah, my point about what Wolfgang said about no system does everything, that's definitely, of course, it's true. But I think as well, like, you've always got to think about, okay, if let's say not one system, but let's say a couple of systems, let's say it's going to do 80%. It's like the 80-20 rule. Is it worth then having another 5 systems to do the other 20%, you know, which might be confusing? Or do you try to make do with what you can have as much as possible so as not to make it a nightmare for everyone to run. Do you know what I mean? I think it's definitely, you need to have a lot of systems, but I think you've always got to balance that against giving people too much.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of, because your initial point, or my point about this conversation was, how do you choose? And I think that's where it starts. It's the system, as John said, the system can't drive the personality drives the system. But actually a step further is your outcomes and needs as an organization, whether it's a school or an organization, have to drive the choice of system or systems. And I think we're at schools, we're often not good enough at eliciting and actually really getting to the point of what it is that we want out of a system. And that's why when we approach or companies approach us, the outcome often isn't quite the one that was desirable or wished for, because the companies don't know necessarily, they don't find the time to explore the pain points of a school and where the school is at, because that's just not their forte. They usually don't have educators doing the selling and the initial rollout. Yep. And we as educators don't spend enough time looking at the business requirements. And when I say business, I also mean the teaching and learning, of course, primarily, but also what are the actual outcomes? What are the needs that we have from a system? And then you're right, the 80-20 rule absolutely applies, because if you can elicit, write down, and be sure about your 80% of needs, then the 20% become more nice to haves or great if it has it. Those kind of like need to have, nice to have, fantastic as an add-on maybe sometime down the line. But I think that's where we're not particularly good at eliciting that, and having then with that a grassroots approach where teachers are part of that as well, to say these are the kind of things, because they've all experienced these systems as well, right? They're usually the ones that actually suffer the most, the ones in the classroom when these systems get rolled out. So they have a pretty good idea, maybe not from a technical point of view, but from an actual practitioner's point of view, how does a good system look like, and what should it do from their perspective.
And I think also, if you think of, I'm just thinking of the big three, Veracross, Power School, and iSEMS. I mean, their bread and butter is schools. But often the issue is, so they do have kind of an understanding of schools, but I think so often schools don't take on the systems thinking approach, where they're very, systematic about what are the needs, what are the disadvantages and advantages. And that requires a lot of discipline and thorough work. And I think sometimes educators, no disrespect, I'm an educator, I understand sometimes that is not something that people get excited about. And it requires you to get very granular and really do your work, do an RFEP, really, understand what do you want, what, like, as you said, Wolfgang, what are the musts, nice to have and fantastic. I think that discipline and that workflow is very difficult, especially when you're in the school day and you're a principal and you got 9 billion other things. And so often IT departments are, given that task, but then they still need the stamp of approval from the principals and the director. And student information systems are not a sexy conversation, and people just roll their eyes. But it's so important to have the systems approach. And I think that's what often generates that disconnect, is that thoroughness in the systems approach and adopting things doesn't take place. And then there's some holes. And that's where you get these frustrations or missed opportunities or expectations that are not met.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I've been doing IT implementations for almost 30 years, I guess, because I was a consultant at Deloitte for a long time, doing big IT projects, across multiple countries and stuff. And it's interesting. I remember something. When I was at university, I studied engineering, and one of the lectures was about they went through a different, like most engineers fell into a certain psychological type, and I don't remember the detail, but it was essentially fear of failure. It wasn't about, you didn't have the psychology of what a great opportunity things are. It's like, I don't want to screw up and get blamed for something. And I think that's an absolute, especially in schools, but I've seen it 100% in businesses. When you're choosing systems, it's all about, okay, what's the least chance of being a huge mess up? Because if you're implementing a big system, it's like a big project, and it can reflect badly on you if it doesn't go well. So do you think that's a lot of the psychology that drives decisions, and is not, having it something that doesn't mess up and make you look bad?
Yeah, I think it's a multitude of things. Unfortunately, there's also a little bit of a cynic in me that says one of the sort of stamp of approvals for an up and coming IT director is the implementation of a major system.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that adds to the frustration of when systems get rolled out, that you're in a school and that here we go again kind of philosophy
Yeah.
of that. But I totally agree with you. I think that fear of failure and then picking the must-haves as the reasoning again to choose a system, and really sometimes probably because of that overlooking some of the need to haves but not must-haves. Sometimes that's what maybe leads to choosing systems that don't quite fit into the ecosystem of a school or the personalities that are there.
Yeah.
And as John says, I really like that. I've never really brought that into the conversation as directly as that, but that notion of personality, we all know that schools and communities have their own personality, but actually tying that into choosing a system is a must. Yeah, I mean, you each school has a different approach to how they approach technology, how willing they are to try things out, and with that, then the choice of system should be personality driven for sure.
Yeah, that was a great point you said about when people come into a job of an IT director. And actually, this is exactly the same in industry as well. They want to put their stamp on something. They want to do an implementation. But the problem with international schools is typically people do a 4 years at a school, 3, 4, 5 years. So then it's like there's constant things coming in, And
Yeah.
I know talking to John, I remember John was always very cautious about bringing new things in. Very like, let me get the lie of the land and see, is it necessary?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Dan. And I think anybody in a leadership position wants to have a stamp. You have to make your mark. I mean, any politician that comes into power. And I think,
Yeah.
and for an IT director, the systems, you want to, if you can move everybody to Google or Microsoft in one shot, that can be a very powerful stamp and also can be very impactful. It can change a school, but that process of doing it, really, you need a team behind you. You have to be very transparent in telling people. I think often with change, we kind of, say all the good things that are happening, but we need to also explain that this is a mourning process. This is like a funeral. You're going to lose things. There are going to be things that are going to be very painful, and just be upfront as much as possible, because so often people aren't. And then people are like, well, hold on, I thought this. And you're like, well, yes, but, so I think that is really challenging, is the actual, as you said, Dan, the implementation. What are the, conversations that you have with the different stakeholders? How do you present yourself? How much information is too much information? How much is not enough information? It is a challenge. And there are many books written about this. And I think, for IT directors, and I think Wolfgang can attest to that, that's often a point of conversation, is like, okay, I have to adopt a new system. What, and the first thing is you reach out to your PLN, is like, what did you do? How did it work? And the problem is, what works in one school doesn't work in another, because every school is so different in its culture and attitudes towards these things.
That's I've actually got this point written down. That's a really good point, what you just said about reaching out to your PLM, because I think, well, you can look at the empirical evidence. Like, schools look at what other schools are doing, and that's, again, to gives them a bit of security. Like, if you look at, say, Veracruz is very big in international schools, also some US private schools, but it's not really big otherwise. Like, there's no reason it couldn't be big in other schools. It's just a case of they've got a network, and all the IT directors in international schools speak to each other. Like you mentioned Power School, ISAMs, and Veracruz. Like, there's plenty of other SISs that are just as good, but they are not used widely. So people tend to use the ones, I think, that everyone else is using. Again, probably to give them some security, give themselves some security.
Absolutely, well, but also that's so true.
Yeah, but also the PLN aspect, right? I mean, I think it's not just the fact that you hear that it's a good system. It's the fact that you've got a whole network of people you can reach out to and say, well, what did you do? How did you do it? And so that support structure is amazing. Going back to a point, John, about you, I mean, my wife's just recently taken up sort of, self-employment or founded a company in IT consultancy, specifically in system implementations. And I now get, like, through her, this insight into not just what I've experienced, but also how other schools approach it. And exactly what you said, John, is like certain stakeholders, key stakeholders, not having been consulted properly or not part of the process because they're not deemed to be important now. But then seeing also that further down that roadmap, when initially the system, let's say Veracross was introduced, and then maybe 2 years later, the finance module suddenly purchased. Well, they weren't part of the initial process 2 years ago. So suddenly they're now part of a system that they have to be part of, and they never had an input into what their needs were or what a system has to do for them. And so that's often also the case, is that these big systems get implemented in sort of a very narrow view or approach, where you really only look at maybe your most important things, which is the teaching and learning aspect, so academics and gradebook and reporting and those kind of things, and then realize, well, actually, this is a much more powerful system. We should do our health module there as well with our nurses, and we should do our learning support, and we should do all of our delicate and highly sensitive information. And then far too late do you come down or come up against these sort of issues then, where maybe say, well, these things don't really talk well to each other, or they don't really integrate well, or they're clunky to use, or that part of the system really doesn't work well. And yeah, I mean, too often have I been in schools where that then becomes the problem, and potentially the driver for then maybe with a change of IT director for somebody to just seize that moment and go, well, why don't we just change the whole thing?
And in that case, the scenario that you described, I've been in situations where you adopt a system and then you're not even aware, in isolation, the business office is on its own kind of investigation, and they go and adopt something, and suddenly you're like, oh, okay. That is, where there's not clear communications. And I think that's where, I teach the principal training course, and we do a whole day on systems. And I really explained to the participants how critical these student information systems. And even though you're a pedagogue as a principal or director, you really have to get your skin underneath that. And I always recommend Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, which is the Bible on systems thinking. And a lot of them come with these stories, because we do case stories, horror stories, where they thought they had something, or they were partly involved, and they just thought, well, I'll give it to my IT department. And, the IT department, in their good heart and with good intent, but because there's some missing pieces and stakeholders, suddenly it turns out that, I think, there are a few success stories out there. But I think that is something that all IT directors really find challenging. And I think their success is leveraged by accessing the professional learning network and really leaning on people. And I do that constantly. I mean, that's the only way, because so often you're quite isolated. When you adopt one of these systems, it's you and your technicians and your database guy. It might be 4 or 5 people. In some schools, it's one person. So who do you turn to? And so the PLN just becomes so critical. And I cannot shared or said, listen, I have a guy here, he can help you, or we did reports this way, here's a code, or here's something. And that is a lifeline. And I think that's what's so important, is really understanding that.
Absolutely. I mean, Brian Lockwood and I run the Tech Director Forum now. I know that you've been part of it far longer than I have, but I mean, we do the Tech Talk Thursdays now. Dan and I were part of that just earlier today, and talking about redundancy and how do you get over, or what can you possibly do when you've got, for example, a singular person whose job and knowledge is data entry, let's say for admissions, and that person falls sick, and you just don't have, or just even for one day, and suddenly a new student arrives and they haven't been inputted, and the student arrives in class in front of the teacher and they're not in any system, they can't log in, so they're basically mute and lame at that moment in their engagement with school systems, and that's kind of where talking about it in a PLC kind of environment really makes you think in your own situation, well, what would I do? Even if you don't have that problem, but just listening to it, and then if you do have that problem, somebody has mentioned it before, you can go back to them and ask them for advice.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, Wolfgang, is this idea that often in schools, there's a small group of people that are trained in the system, often office staff, maybe some IT people, maybe digital learning coaches, but there's so few. And when one is gone, then that knowledge is gone. And it's, and that's why I know in my own experience, I've always had a consultant. I've always find a consultant that's an expert in the system that I can call. And I've done that with different systems, is just say, listen, I'm going to bank this person. I'm going to get them on a contract. So when that key person in the office is not there, I can quickly turn to them and they can jump in. Because I think so often the resources you have to do this implementation are minimal. Often it's very few people. And, you know, the company does their 190-day implementation, then they're gone. Every time you call them, they often start asking you for money. And then, you know, your CEO says, I thought the system worked. Why are we spending more money, you know?
Yeah. That's interesting. I think it's what you mentioned about the redundancy. I mean, John, if you remember the first ever Google event we ran in Prague, in fact, the first ever European Google event for education, there's a friend of mine, Stefan Lacker, came across. He's from Google, really senior guy. I mean, when I was a IT contractor, I worked for him on multiple projects. Like he's run like, you know, multi, you know, maybe even 100 million, you know, projects and stuff. And if you remember, we had a talk with the directors of all the CISA schools at lunchtime, and he said that an interesting point that in his like whatever how many years of doing this, like the main reason any IT implementation failed was lack of training. So there was always lack of training. That was the key factor above anything else, is getting people involved. I think it's really important. You've got to make sure, and you not just train people, like you said, redundancy. You've got to, more than one person's got to know everything as well.
And that training point is so important. And so often, you know, there's just not the time. And, you know, I think often it's also the season. When do you do this? Yep. Do you do this at the beginning of the year or spring? So Dan, you know, we migrated to Google Workspace. In those days it was called Education. But I remember you were instrumental, and we decided to do it in May. And everybody's like, why are you doing it in May? Because you don't want to start the new school year with a new system. We were like, at least in May, people can, you know, it's the end of the year. There's a little more gap. And I think that worked really well, because then in the fall, everything was up and running. But, you know, if you try to, you know, I know some schools, they do their whole system over the summer because nobody's there. Then people walk in and they're like, what is a system? What is this?
That's the worst way. And, I agree. Definitely.
You're fighting for time of PD during orientation week where curriculum people are taking it. So I think the season also can be really critical.
Plus as an IT director, you want to get a bit of a break in the summer, and you just like, that's the one way to like stress yourself out completely, is a big implementation over the summer, knowing everyone's coming back and not having seen the system. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so true. That a well-being point's a good one, Dan.
Sorry, Wolfgang, I interrupted you.
No. I was just agreeing with this, and I think that's actually quite a unique position I found myself in, moving to Ecolant this time around, because I came from the industry, as you know, having the opportunity to start in May in this case. You know, like just like you said, not that I'm the system, but having that opportunity also to come in at the tail end of a year, not at the beginning of the year, and then starting the year in a place where not everything is brand new. So I can fully relate to what you're saying, John, about that feeling with systems is the same as we have, of course, starting, as you just recently did, starting at a new school, where you just have to, you know, find your way around the buildings, let alone systems. So to get all information about systems, it's just overwhelming. So yeah, we definitely have to think about which season, which time of the year, and how to roll out those systems.
Definitely. Well, look, guys, I think that's probably a good place to finish. Now, John, you've got to rush off to another meeting, and it's been great. I think we'll release it as a bonus episode. It was a really great kind of concise topic to talk about. So, thanks a lot, Wolfgang, for bringing it up.
Yeah, Wolfgang, thank you. No, it's one that I think people what would be interesting is maybe getting a panel of directors together and different people that have had different experiences, because I wonder if there's some common threads, or there's some people that have found the magic bullet. You know, there's no doubt if you have a lot of money, and you can really kind of stack your implementation with consultancy hours and even bringing people on site. That is something that is, you know, I'm all for virtual, but nothing's like having the student information system expert on site for a week or two, which is extremely expensive. But I think so often, you know, time zones are different. So that's something that I definitely have learned, is get them physically on campus as you do this.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Thanks, Wolfgang. Thanks, John. And speak
Lovely
again
seeing
soon.
everybody. And yeah, have a good evening. Dan, have a wonderful trip. Let's connect before you go just to say hi. And can't
Sounds
wait
good.
to hear about your travels in Asia.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, guys.
Fabulous. Thanks a lot.
Safe travels.
Bye-bye.
See you,
See you.
Wolfgang.
Bye.